Chapter 1. The Tick of the Clock. The old grandfather clock stood in the corner of the dimly lit room, its brass pendulum swinging with a deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo louder in the silence. Each tick reverberated through the space, an unyielding reminder of time's relentless march forward. Outside, snow fell in delicate, deliberate spirals, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. Yet within the walls of the sprawling estate, the air was thick with unease, a tension that clung to the shadows. Eleanor St. James, the enigmatic matriarch of the household, sat in her high-backed armchair by the frosted window. Her silhouette was a study in elegance, draped in velvet and framed by the faint light of a dwindling fire. Her gaze was fixed beyond the glass, watching the snow obscure the path leading up to the estate. It was as though she were expecting something, or someone. The soft glow of candlelight flickered around her, casting elongated shadows that danced on the walls, as if the very house were alive and restless. The room, though richly adorned with festive decorations, felt cold and uninviting. Garlands of pine and crimson ribbon looped along the mantel, and a towering Christmas tree stood sentinel in the corner, its ornaments gleaming like captured stars. Yet the cheerfulness of the season seemed at odds with the oppressive atmosphere. Beneath the ornate trappings of Noel, there was an unsettling stillness, a sense that the house itself was holding its breath. Eleanor's mind drifted, as it often did in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Memories, fragmented and fleeting, surfaced unbidden, a kaleidoscope of joy and sorrow, of faces now lost to time. It had been years since the events of that fateful December, yet the weight of those days remained, like a chain that refused to loosen its grip. The clock's rhythmic ticking seemed to mock her, each swing of the pendulum dragging her closer to the inevitable. Upstairs, in the solitude of her room, young Adelaide St. James stared at the small, wrapped parcel resting on her vanity. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed the nervous energy coursing through her. Adelaide was the youngest of the family, barely 17, with an air of quiet curiosity that often set her apart. The parcel had arrived that morning, left on the doorstep without explanation. It bore no sender's name, only a tag with 3 words inscribed in elegant handwriting: "Do not open." The mystery of the package consumed her thoughts, weaving its way through her mind like an insidious thread. Who had left it? Why was it addressed to her? She had resolved not to touch it, but as the hours crept by, the pull of curiosity grew harder to resist. The snow outside muffled the world, cocooning her in an eerie silence. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters below, Thomas, the estate's loyal groundskeeper, moved through the narrow hallways with practiced efficiency. He was a man of few words, stoic and reliable, with an uncanny ability to sense when something was amiss. Tonight, the stillness unsettled him more than usual. The air felt charged, as though something unseen loomed just beyond the edge of perception. Thomas paused at the kitchen window, his sharp eyes scanning the snow-covered grounds. For a moment, he thought he saw movement near the tree line, a shadow that flickered and disappeared. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the landscape was undisturbed, pristine in its wintry beauty. Still, a prickle of unease settled in his chest, and he decided to patrol the grounds once more before retiring for the night. Back in the drawing room, Eleanor rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and graceful. She approached the mantelpiece, where an assortment of photographs was arranged. Her fingers lingered over one in particular, a faded image of her late husband and their 2 children, taken years ago on a bright summer's day. The sight of it brought an ache to her chest, a reminder of what had been lost. The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the house like a somber bell. Eleanor turned toward the sound, her expression unreadable. Midnight marked the first of 12 days, days she both anticipated and dreaded. For within those days lay the culmination of an unspoken promise, a vow she had made long ago. Unbeknownst to her, in the quiet of her room, Adelaide reached for the mysterious parcel, her fingers trembling. As she turned it over in her hands, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as though someone were knocking on glass. She froze, her breath hitching, and glanced toward the window. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, obscuring her view of the grounds below. In the distance, the clock continued its steady rhythm. Each tick seemed louder than the last, resonating through the house, counting down to something none of them could foresee. And as the final chime faded into silence, the estate was left shrouded in an uneasy stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. The countdown had begun. Chapter 2: Snowfalls and Secrets. The snow continued to fall with a relentless determination, its weight pressing down on the world like a heavy quilt. Morning came reluctantly, its light muted and gray, as though the sun itself had no desire to rise. The St. James estate sat cloaked in its wintry shroud, a place both beautiful and foreboding. From the outside, it appeared as serene as a snow globe, but within its walls, unease rippled like an undercurrent, pulling its occupants into an invisible tide. Eleanor was already awake, seated once again by the grand window of the drawing room. The previous night's events lingered in her mind. The clock's midnight chime, the strange feeling that had settled over the house, and, most unsettling of all, the faint knock on the glass that she had almost convinced herself was imagined. Her hands rested on her lap, one clutching the delicate locket she always wore, its gold surface warm against her skin. The locket held no photograph, no relic of a loved one. Instead, it bore a single engraving inside, an intricate snowflake etched with exquisite precision. It was a symbol of something far more significant than ornamentation, a token from the past that Eleanor guarded fiercely. She had never explained its meaning, even to her children, and today, as she traced its edges with her thumb, the weight of its significance pressed on her more than ever. Adelaide, too, had risen early, though the events of the night had left her unsettled. The mysterious parcel still sat on her vanity, untouched but no less beguiling. She had tried to put it out of her mind, to focus instead on the day's preparations, but the pull of its mystery was relentless. She had asked the servants about it, but no one admitted to having seen it arrive. Even Thomas, whose sharp eyes rarely missed a detail, had been unaware of its delivery. She stood now at her window, peering out at the snow-covered grounds. The landscape was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and sigh of an old house. As her eyes scanned the trees, she thought she caught a flicker of movement again, the same shadow she had almost seen the night before. But when she focused, there was nothing. Only the wind stirring the branches and the snow swirling in endless patterns. In the servants' quarters, Thomas was already dressed and preparing to brave the cold for his morning rounds. His breath puffed in the icy air as he stepped outside, his boots crunching against the fresh layer of snow. He carried a lantern, its golden glow casting long shadows as he moved across the grounds. The estate was vast, its gardens and paths winding like veins through the property, and Thomas knew every inch of it by heart. But today, something felt different. As he reached the edge of the forest, he paused, his instincts prickling. The snow was undisturbed, yet the air carried an unfamiliar charge, as though the landscape itself were holding its breath. He lingered for a moment, scanning the tree-line, but nothing moved. Shaking his head, he turned back toward the house, his lantern swinging gently with each step. Inside, Eleanor had begun her morning ritual, instructing the staff on the day's tasks and overseeing the arrangements for the holiday festivities. The preparations were a yearly tradition, a way to bring a semblance of joy to the season despite the heaviness that lingered in the family's history. She moved with practiced poise, her voice calm and steady, but beneath her composed exterior, her mind churned. Her thoughts drifted to a memory she had long buried, a Christmas long ago when everything had changed. She rarely allowed herself to revisit those days, yet now, with the countdown begun, the memories surfaced unbidden. There had been snow then too, a storm so fierce it had cut them off from the outside world. And in the isolation, a secret had unraveled, one that had left scars no snowfall could ever cover. Adelaide found herself drawn to the library, seeking solace among the rows of books that smelled of leather and age. It was a place of comfort for her, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in stories far removed from her own. But today, even the library felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, her fingers brushing the spines of books as though searching for something she couldn't name. Her gaze landed on a particular volume, its leather cover embossed with a delicate snowflake, one that looked eerily similar to the engraving on her mother's locket. She pulled the book from the shelf, its weight solid in her hands. As she opened it, a folded piece of parchment slipped out, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. Adelaide hesitated before picking it up, her pulse quickening. The parchment was yellowed with age, its edges frayed. Unfolding it carefully, she found a sketch of the estate, meticulously drawn and labeled. But something about it was strange. There were markings on the map, small symbols she didn't recognize, scattered across the grounds like a secret code. She tucked the map back into the book, her mind racing. What did it mean? Who had drawn it? And why had it been hidden there? As the day wore on, the snow showed no sign of stopping, and the estate seemed to retreat further into its own world. Eleanor remained in the drawing room, lost in thought. Adelaide returned to her room, the mysterious map tucked safely in her pocket. And Thomas, ever watchful, patrolled the grounds again, his unease growing with each passing hour. By the time the grandfather clock chimed again, marking the close of the day, the house had settled into a tense silence. Each of its inhabitants carried their own questions, their own secrets, yet none spoke of them aloud. And outside, in the shadows of the forest, something stirred. The snow fell heavier now, obscuring the figure that moved with purpose, its presence unnoticed but no less real. The countdown continued, and with it, the invisible threads binding the St. James family grew tighter. Chapter 3. The List That Changed Everything. The morning dawned colder than the day before, with frost creeping across the windows like delicate lace. The snow from the night had settled into a thick, unbroken blanket, muffling the sounds of the estate. Even the birds seemed to hold their songs in deference to the quiet unease that lingered over the grounds. Inside the St. James estate, the warmth of the crackling fires could not entirely chase away the chill that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. Eleanor sat at the head of the long dining table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The vast room, adorned with garlands of holly and the faint glow of candlelight, felt cavernous in its silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall carried faintly through the air, its sound a constant reminder of time's passage. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the polished surface of the table, her thoughts distant. She had been dreaming again, though she could scarcely recall the details upon waking. The dream was always the same: a snow-covered forest, an indistinct figure, and the sound of bells tolling faintly in the distance. It left her with a feeling of inevitability, as though something long dormant was stirring once more. She glanced at the locket hanging from her neck, its presence both a comfort and a burden. Upstairs, Adelaide stirred in her bed, the mysterious map from the library still folded beneath her pillow. She had lain awake long into the night, her mind a swirl of questions and possibilities. The symbols on the map intrigued her, their meaning just out of reach. Each mark seemed deliberate, as though it pointed to something hidden. And then there was the snowflake design, identical to the one on her mother's locket. She rose quietly, the creak of the floorboards beneath her bare feet startling in the stillness. Crossing to her vanity, she glanced at the parcel, still untouched but ever present in her thoughts. Its simple tag mocked her resolve. Do not open. She had resisted so far, but the weight of its mystery was beginning to wear on her. Adelaide turned away and slipped the map from beneath her pillow. Unfolding it once more, she studied the markings in the faint light of the window. One symbol in particular caught her eye, a small star drawn near the southern edge of the estate grounds. It was the only mark of its kind on the map, distinct and deliberate. Downstairs, Thomas was making his rounds. The snow had delayed deliveries to the estate, and he had taken it upon himself to prepare for the coming storm. He carried an armful of firewood into the kitchen, his boots leaving wet tracks on the stone floor. The kitchen staff greeted him with polite nods, but Thomas's focus was elsewhere. The unease he had felt the previous day still clung to him, an invisible weight on his shoulders. As he exited the kitchen and stepped back into the cold, something caught his eye near the front steps, a scrap of paper partially buried in the snow. Curious, he stooped to pick it up, shaking the frost from its surface. The paper was yellowed and creased, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. Its contents, however, made his breath catch. It was a list, written in a hand both elegant and hurried. The names on it were familiar: Eleanor St. James, Adelaide St. James, and Thomas himself. Beneath each name was a single word: promise. Thomas stared at the paper, his heartbeat quickening. He turned it over, searching for a clue to its origin, but the other side was blank save for a faint watermark of a snowflake. His mind raced as he tucked the list into his pocket, determined to show it to Eleanor at the first opportunity. Back inside, Eleanor had moved to the library, seeking solace among the collection of books and documents she had spent years curating. She traced her fingers along the spines of volumes she had read countless times, her thoughts heavy. Her hand paused on one in particular, a journal bound in soft leather, its cover unmarked. She pulled it from the shelf and carried it to the small writing desk by the window. The journal was old, its pages filled with entries written in her late husband's hand. She turned to a specific section, one she had read many times before, and her eyes scanned the familiar words. December 22nd. The snow has come early this year, and with it, the weight of our agreement. I fear what lies ahead, but I cannot turn away now. The promises we made must be upheld, no matter the cost. Eleanor closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, her breath unsteady. The words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the choices they had made long ago and the consequences they had yet to face. Upstairs, Adelaide had dressed warmly and ventured outside, the map tucked into her coat. She moved through the snow with careful steps, her eyes scanning the grounds for any sign of the marked location. The southern edge of the property was seldom visited, a dense cluster of trees that had grown wild over the years. When she reached the tree line, she paused, the map in one hand and a lantern in the other. The shadows beneath the trees were deep, the snow undisturbed. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her boots crunching softly. She followed the map's markings as best she could, the path winding through the woods like a forgotten trail. Finally, she came upon it, a small clearing marked by a weathered stone carved with a single snowflake. It stood half buried in the snow, its surface worn but unmistakable. Adelaide knelt beside it, brushing the snow away to reveal an inscription. To those who remember, the truth lies within. Her heart raced as she traced the words with her fingers. What truth? And why had this been hidden here? Before she could ponder further, a sound broke the stillness, a faint crack of a branch, as though someone was nearby. She stood quickly, her lantern swinging as she turned toward the source of the sound. The forest was silent again, the snow falling softly, but Adelaide knew she wasn't alone. Back at the estate, the clock struck noon, its chimes reverberating through the halls. Eleanor, Thomas, and Adelaide each felt the sound in their own way, a reminder of time slipping away, of secrets yet uncovered. And in the distance, beneath the veil of falling snow, a shadow moved with purpose. The list, the map, the locket, each piece was part of a puzzle none of them fully understood. But the countdown continued, drawing them inexorably toward a truth they could no longer avoid. Chapter 4. Echoes Beneath the Mistletoe. The snowstorm showed no sign of abating as the day stretched on, shrouding the St. James estate in a perpetual twilight. The winds howled with an eerie resonance, rattling the windows and tugging at the heavy drapes. It was a day when time felt elastic, stretching and folding, leaving the inhabitants of the house suspended in a liminal space between past and present. Eleanor sat in her private study, a room few dared to enter uninvited. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could retreat from the demands of her household and the whispers of ghosts she tried to ignore. The desk before her was littered with papers, letters, and documents she had unearthed from a hidden compartment in the library. Among them was a single piece of aged parchment, its edges frayed and its ink faded, but its significance undiminished. It was a contract, written in an archaic hand and bearing a seal embossed with the now familiar snowflake motif. Eleanor's eyes scanned the words, their meaning heavy with implications she had tried to bury for years. The agreement had been struck decades ago, long before Adelaide's birth and before Thomas had joined their household. It was an oath made under desperate circumstances, a promise that had shaped their lives in ways none of them fully understood. Eleanor's hand trembled as she traced the seal, her mind drifting back to the night it was signed. She had been young then, blinded by love and fear, willing to do anything to protect what she held dear. The memory of that night was a wound that had never healed, a secret she carried alone. Downstairs, Thomas stood in the foyer, the scrap of paper he had found burning a hole in his pocket. He had shown it to no one, unsure of what it meant or how to broach the subject with Eleanor. Instead, he busied himself with the mundane tasks of the day, his movements mechanical and his thoughts elsewhere. The list haunted him. His name written alongside Eleanor's and Adelaide's felt like a brand, a connection to something far larger than himself. The word beneath it, promise, was both cryptic and damning. Thomas had always prided himself on his loyalty to the St. James family, but this was different. This felt like a thread pulling him into a web he hadn't realized existed. Adelaide, meanwhile, had not yet returned from the woods. The clearing with the stone marker had filled her with more questions than answers, and the sound she had heard, the crack of a branch, lingered in her mind. She had searched the area thoroughly, her lantern casting long shadows against the snow, but she had found no one. Now, as she made her way back toward the estate, the map tucked securely inside her coat, she felt a strange sensation, as though the trees themselves were watching her. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying a melody she could not quite place. It was hauntingly familiar, like a song from a childhood she had forgotten. When she finally reached the edge of the forest, the sight of the estate brought little comfort. The house loomed against the storm, its silhouette dark and unwelcoming. Adelaide hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the snow-covered lawn, her boots crunching loudly in the silence. Inside, Eleanor had begun to pace, her usual composure fraying under the weight of her thoughts. She paused by the fireplace, her gaze fixed on the flames. The crackle and pop of the burning logs were soothing in their own way, a reminder that some things were still within her control. But the truth was that control was slipping away. The locket around her neck felt heavier than ever, its presence a constant reminder of the choices she had made. She thought of Adelaide, her bright and curious daughter, who had no idea of the legacy she had inherited. And then there was Thomas, steadfast and reliable, yet bound to them by forces he couldn't begin to comprehend. Eleanor knew she couldn't keep the truth from them much longer. The countdown had begun, and the signs were impossible to ignore. The parcel that had appeared in Adelaide's room, the map hidden in the library, the list found in the snow. Each was a harbinger of what was to come. When Adelaide finally entered the house, shaking the snow from her coat, she found Eleanor waiting for her in the foyer. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Adelaide climbed the stairs to her room, her steps heavy. She felt as though the house itself were pressing in on her, its walls alive with secrets. When she reached her room, she locked the door behind her and retrieved the map. Spreading it out on her desk, she studied it with renewed intensity, her fingers tracing the symbols. What struck her now was the realization that the map wasn't complete. There were faint outlines of what appeared to be additional markings, as though the mapmaker had started to draw them but had stopped. Adelaide stared at the blank spaces, her mind racing. If this map was a guide, what was it leading to? In the servants' quarters, Thomas unfolded the list once more, his eyes scanning the names. He noticed something he hadn't before, a faint watermark in the corner of the page. It was the same snowflake that adorned Eleanor's locket and the map Adelaide had found. The snowflake seemed to tie everything together, though how or why eluded him. He resolved to speak to Eleanor, but when he approached her study, the door was closed, and the sound of muffled sobs stopped him in his tracks. Thomas lingered in the hallway for a moment before retreating. The realization that even Eleanor, who seemed unshakable, was burdened by something so deeply unsettled him. As night fell, the storm intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. Each inhabitant of the house found themselves alone with their thoughts, their secrets, and their fears. The clock struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the silent halls. And in the shadows beyond the estate, a figure moved through the snow, its purpose unwavering. The countdown continued, and with it, the weight of forgotten oaths bore down on the St. James family like an inescapable storm. Chapter 5. A Gift Wrapped in Shadows. The dawn broke reluctantly, its pale light barely penetrating the dense clouds overhead. The storm had lessened overnight, but the air was still thick with an unnatural quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The snow lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket that concealed more than just the ground beneath it. Eleanor had spent the night in her study, her mind a whirlwind of memories and fears. The papers she had been reading were now scattered across the desk, their edges curling slightly in the warmth of the fire. She hadn't slept, the weight of her secrets pressing too heavily on her chest. The journal, the contract, the letters. They were fragments of a story she had tried to forget, a tale of choices made in desperation and promises that could not be broken. She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, and crossed to the window. The view of the estate grounds was obscured by frost and condensation, but she could just make out the forest at the edge of the property. The clearing Adelaide had discovered was out there, hidden among the trees. Eleanor wondered how much her daughter had pieced together and whether she was ready to face the truth. Adelaide, for her part, had hardly slept. The map lay open on her desk, its cryptic symbols and incomplete markings taunting her. She had spent hours trying to decipher its meaning, but the more she stared at it, the more elusive the answers became. She couldn't shake the feeling that the map was alive in some way, its purpose shifting just out of reach. She had thought about the stone in the clearing, its inscription and the snowflake carved into its surface. It felt like a clue, a key to something greater, but what that something was remained a mystery. And then there was the sound she had heard, the crack of a branch that had sent her heart racing. She had told herself it was nothing, perhaps a deer or a falling limb, but the unease lingered. Adelaide pulled a thick sweater over her head and laced up her boots. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to find them in her room. Tucking the map into her coat, she slipped out of her room and descended the grand staircase. The house was quiet, the staff busying themselves with their morning routines. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, and Adelaide was grateful for the solitude. As she stepped outside, the cold air bit at her cheeks, and her breath formed small clouds in the still air. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she made her way toward the woods. The clearing called to her, its mystery too compelling to resist. Meanwhile, Thomas was in the stables, tending to the horses. The routine work was a welcome distraction from the thoughts that had plagued him since finding the list. He hadn't told Eleanor about it yet, unsure of how to broach the subject. Instead, he kept it folded neatly in his pocket, a secret he carried close to his heart. The horses were restless, their movements jittery as though they could sense the tension that hung over the estate. Thomas ran a soothing hand over the flank of a bay mare, his murmured reassurances doing little to calm her. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, a presence just out of sight. When he stepped outside, the wind carried a faint sound to his ears, a melody, soft and haunting. It was almost imperceptible, like the whisper of the snow itself, but it stopped him in his tracks. He turned toward the forest, his eyes scanning the tree-line for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the stillness of the snow and the shadows cast by the bare branches. Thomas hesitated before making his way toward the house. The list in his pocket felt heavier with each step, and he knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. Adelaide reached the clearing with little difficulty, her steps guided by the map and her memory. The stone marker stood exactly as she had left it, its surface now dusted with a fresh layer of snow. She knelt beside it, brushing the snow away to reveal the inscription once more. To those who remember, the truth lies within. She traced the words with her fingers, the cold stone rough beneath her touch. What truth? And within what? Adelaide's frustration grew as she searched the area for additional clues. Her hands combed through the snow, uncovering nothing but frozen earth and dead leaves. It was then that she noticed a faint depression in the ground, just a few feet from the stone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it looked unnatural, as though something beneath the snow had shifted. Adelaide hesitated before digging with her hands, the cold biting at her fingers as she brushed away the snow. Her efforts uncovered a small wooden box, its surface weathered and its edges bound with metal. It looked ancient, its craftsmanship meticulous despite the passage of time. Adelaide's heart raced as she lifted it from the ground, her breath catching in her throat. The box was sealed with a simple latch, and she hesitated before opening it. Inside, she found a folded piece of parchment and a small, intricately carved key. The parchment bore the same snowflake watermark as the map, the list, and Eleanor's locket. Adelaide unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. The path forward requires what was promised. Only those bound by oath may enter. Adelaide's mind reeled. What promise? And what did it mean to be bound by oath? She slipped the key and parchment into her coat pocket, her thoughts racing as she made her way back toward the estate. At the house, Thomas finally confronted Eleanor in the study. He handed her the list without a word, his expression grave. Eleanor's face paled as she read the names, her hands trembling. The word promise beneath each name felt like a verdict, a reminder of the bonds they could not escape. Eleanor sank into her chair, her composure crumbling. "It's starting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas said nothing, but the weight of her words settled heavily on him. The storm outside had quieted, but within the walls of the St. James estate, a tempest was brewing, its force undeniable. And as the clock struck noon, its chime echoing through the halls, a figure emerged from the forest, their presence hidden by the swirling snow. The countdown continued, each moment bringing them closer to a revelation none of them were prepared to face. Chapter 6: Crimson on the Snow. The morning unfolded under an oppressive gray sky, casting the St. James estate in an air of perpetual twilight. The storm from the night before had left a thick layer of snow over the grounds, muffling the world in an unnatural quiet. Eleanor had spent the early hours pacing the study, the list Thomas had given her clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind churned with questions and fears, the weight of her past decisions pressing down like the snow on the rooftops. She felt as though she were staring into an abyss, one she had created and one she could no longer avoid. She knew the parchment Adelaide had found, the map, and the markings carved into the stone were no coincidences. They were signs, harbingers of the reckoning she had tried to outrun for so long. Adelaide, oblivious to the storm raging within her mother, was back in her room, poring over the items she had unearthed in the clearing. The key she had found was small, its design intricate and strangely familiar. She turned it over in her hands, studying the delicate etchings along its edges. It seemed to pulse with its own energy, as though it held secrets waiting to be unlocked. The parchment was no less mysterious. The phrase, "Only those bound by oath may enter," repeated in her mind like a haunting refrain. Adelaide knew the words were significant, a clue pointing her towards something hidden, but what exactly that something was remained maddeningly unclear. She spread the map out on her desk once more, her fingers tracing its lines and symbols. There were faint marks she hadn't noticed before, shapes that seemed to shimmer when caught in the right light. They formed a pattern, one that seemed to correspond to the estate grounds. Adelaide's heart quickened as she realized that the map wasn't leading her into the woods. It was leading her deeper into the house itself. Thomas, meanwhile, had taken to the attic, a place rarely visited except for when storage space was needed. The air was heavy with dust, and the light from his lantern cast long shadows against the walls. He had come here searching for answers, though he wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to find. The list had shaken him, its implications unraveling everything he thought he knew about the St. James family and his own place within it. The attic was a repository of forgotten things. Trunks filled with moth-eaten clothes, boxes of old photographs, and furniture long since deemed unnecessary. Thomas sifted through the clutter, his eyes scanning for anything that might shed light on the mystery. It was in the farthest corner, behind a stack of crates, that he found something unusual. A chest, different from the others, its exterior adorned with the same snowflake motif that had become a recurring symbol in their lives. Thomas hesitated before opening it, his pulse quickening. Inside, he found a collection of items that seemed to belong to another era. A tattered journal, its leather cover worn with age, rested on top of a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Beneath them was a large sheet of paper, folded and yellowed with time. Thomas unfolded it carefully, revealing what appeared to be an architectural drawing of the estate. The diagram was detailed, showing not just the rooms and corridors but something else, a network of tunnels and passages hidden within the walls. Thomas stared at the drawing in disbelief, his mind racing. Why had these tunnels been built, and what purpose did they serve? Back in her room, Adelaide was tracing the map's markings with renewed intensity when she noticed something strange. The key she had found seemed to fit into a small indentation in the map itself, a detail she hadn't seen before. Holding her breath, she pressed the key into the groove, and the map shifted beneath her fingers. A new layer revealed itself, one that had been hidden beneath the surface. Adelaide gasped as she saw what it contained. A detailed rendering of the estate's interior, with a single line leading to a marked point deep within its foundation. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The map wasn't a guide to the woods or the grounds. It was leading her to something buried beneath the house. Eleanor, still in her study, had finally gathered the courage to read through the list in its entirety. The names burned into her memory. Hers, Adelaide's, Thomas's, were accompanied by dates and cryptic notes. The word promise was repeated again and again, its meaning as elusive as ever. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself much longer. The signs were becoming too obvious, the pieces falling into place whether she wanted them to or not. As the day wore on, the three of them moved through the house like shadows, each consumed by their own discoveries and fears. Adelaide descended to the basement, following the map's instructions, her lantern casting a faint glow against the cold stone walls. Thomas, with the drawing of the tunnels in hand, began exploring the hidden passages, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors. Eleanor, finally leaving the study, found herself drawn to the library, her fingers brushing against the spines of books she had read countless times. She paused by a section she hadn't touched in years, her eyes falling on a single volume that seemed out of place. She pulled it from the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was another journal, this one bearing her own initials. She opened it, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. It was hers, but the words on the page felt like they belonged to someone else, a younger, more desperate version of herself. The journal detailed events she had tried to forget, choices she had made under duress, and the pact that had bound her family to something far beyond their understanding. As she read, the truth became inescapable. By the time the sun set, all three had uncovered fragments of a story that was bigger than themselves. Adelaide found a locked door deep within the basement, its surface marked with the now familiar snowflake. Thomas discovered a hidden room within the tunnels, its walls lined with old maps and notes. And Eleanor, clutching her journal, felt the weight of her secrets threatening to crush her. The clock struck midnight, its chime resonating through the house like a warning. The snow outside began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the world in silence. And somewhere deep within the estate, the secrets of the St. James family stirred, waiting for the moment they would finally be revealed. Chapter 7. The 12 days begin. The storm returned in the early hours of the morning, casting the estate in a shroud of white. Snowflakes fell in swirling patterns, dancing on gusts of wind that howled like a mournful choir. Inside the St. James estate, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes an unspoken reckoning. Adelaide was the first to stir, her thoughts still tangled in the discoveries of the previous day. The locked door in the basement weighed heavily on her mind, its snowflake-marked surface a silent guardian of whatever lay beyond. She couldn't help but feel that every step she had taken since finding the map had been leading her here. She rose from her bed and dressed quickly, wrapping herself in layers to combat the chill of the house. The map was tucked into her coat pocket, alongside the key she had found in the clearing. She slipped out of her room and down the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. The house was quiet, its occupants still lost in sleep or consumed by their own secrets. The descent into the basement felt different this time, the air heavier and colder with each step. The faint light of her lantern flickered against the stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to shift and twist. Adelaide reached the locked door, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled the key from her pocket and hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. With a deep breath, she slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing a passageway that descended even further into the earth. The air beyond the threshold was damp and tinged with a metallic tang. Adelaide's lantern illuminated rough-hewn walls and a narrow path that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. She stepped forward, her resolve outweighing her fear. Meanwhile, Thomas was deep within the tunnels he had discovered in the attic's architectural drawing. The narrow passages wound through the walls of the house, their existence a testament to secrets long buried. He carried a lantern in one hand and the diagram in the other, his eyes scanning for any sign of the rooms marked on the map. He had already found 2 hidden chambers, their contents cryptic and unsettling. One had contained a collection of old photographs, their edges curled and their images faded. The faces in the pictures were unfamiliar, save for one. A young Eleanor, her expression somber and her eyes heavy with something Thomas couldn't quite name. The second chamber had been filled with books and documents, many written in languages he didn't understand. Among them was a single sheet of paper, its surface marked with the snowflake emblem. The words on the page were faint but legible. The pact endures. The lineage continues. Thomas pressed on, his steps cautious as the tunnels grew narrower and darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became, as though the tunnels themselves were alive. Eleanor, unaware of Adelaide's and Thomas's movements, had spent the night immersed in her journal. The memories it contained had resurfaced like ghosts, each word a reminder of the choices she had made and the promises she had broken. She felt as though the walls of the house were closing in on her, the secrets she had buried now clawing their way to the surface. She rose from her chair and moved to the library, her hands trembling as she pulled a series of books from the shelves. Behind them was a hidden panel, one she hadn't touched in decades. With a sharp tug, the panel swung open, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward. Eleanor lit a lantern and descended, her steps slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, the flickering light casting eerie patterns on the walls. The staircase ended in a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves. On one of them was a box identical to the one Adelaide had found in the clearing. She opened it carefully, her breath hitching as she saw its contents. Another key, this one larger and more ornate, rested on a bed of velvet. Beneath it was a sheet of parchment bearing the same phrase Adelaide had found. The path forward requires what was promised. Only those bound by oath may enter. Eleanor sank to the ground, the weight of her past decisions threatening to crush her. She knew what the words meant and what was waiting for her family. Adelaide's journey through the underground passage led her to a large chamber, its walls carved with intricate symbols and patterns. At the center was a pedestal, and atop it sat a small, intricately designed box. Her lantern's light danced across its surface, highlighting the same snowflake motif that had followed her since the beginning. She approached the box cautiously, her fingers brushing against its surface. The moment she touched it, a low hum filled the chamber, the sound resonating in her bones. The lid of the box opened on its own, revealing another piece of parchment. The words on the page made her blood run cold. The clock is ticking. Choose wisely, for the future depends on the past. As Adelaide stood in the chamber, the hum subsided, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the passage behind her. She turned, her lantern casting long shadows as she strained to see who, or what, was approaching. In the tunnels, Thomas finally reached the room marked on the diagram. It was larger than the others, its walls lined with shelves filled with jars and vials of strange substances. At the center of the room was a large table, its surface covered in papers and tools. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might explain its purpose. Among the papers was a ledger, its entries written in a script he could barely decipher. But one phrase stood out, repeated multiple times. The debt must be paid. The clock struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the estate like a tolling bell. Adelaide, Thomas, and Eleanor each felt its weight, the sound a reminder that time was slipping away. And in the distance, beyond the estate and the storm, something stirred. A presence long forgotten but never truly gone. The countdown had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 8. Behind the frosted windowpane. The storm raged outside with renewed ferocity, the wind's relentless howls clawing against the windows like a feral beast. The estate stood as a fortress against the elements, its imposing frame buried under a growing mantle of snow. Yet within its walls, the storm was no less fierce, as secrets and shadows wove a web of tension among its inhabitants. Adelaide remained in the subterranean chamber, the parchment's cryptic words a cipher she couldn't yet unravel. The clock is ticking. Choose wisely, for the future depends on the past. Her thoughts churned with questions. What choice was being demanded of her, and what was it about her family's past that seemed so vital to the present? The box she had opened sat inert now, its purpose served, yet it seemed to vibrate faintly with an energy Adelaide couldn't explain. She traced the snowflake design on its lid with trembling fingers, as though seeking answers from the object itself. Her lantern cast flickering light against the walls, revealing more carvings she hadn't noticed before. Depictions of winter storms, keys, and a single figure standing at the center of it all, shrouded in mystery. Above her, Thomas emerged from the tunnels, his discovery of the ledger leaving him more shaken than he cared to admit. The repeated phrase, "The debt must be paid," echoed in his mind like a bell-tolling doom. He made his way toward the main part of the house, the architectural diagram still clutched in his hand. As he climbed the stairs, his footfalls were muffled by the thick silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The estate felt alive, its walls whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. He reached the library and hesitated, his hand resting on the door. A faint light flickered from within, and he pushed the door open cautiously. Inside, he found Eleanor seated at a desk, the ornate key from the hidden panel lying before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Eleanor's thoughts were a maelstrom of regret and determination. The journal she had unearthed in the secret library chamber had laid bare her sins, the promises she had made, and the consequences her family now faced. She had written those words herself decades ago, a younger version of herself desperate to protect what she held dear. But desperation, she now realized, had blinded her to the cost. Thomas approached cautiously, his eyes flicking to the journal. Without a word, Eleanor slid it across the desk toward him. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers brushing against the aged leather cover. As he read, his expression darkened, the words unraveling everything he thought he knew about the woman who had raised him. The journal spoke of a pact made long ago, a bargain struck in the shadow of desperation. It detailed an agreement with an entity Eleanor referred to only as the Keeper, a figure cloaked in winter's imagery and bound by an ancient code. The terms of the pact were clear: prosperity and protection for the St. James family, in exchange for an unspoken promise that would one day come due. Thomas closed the journal and looked at Eleanor, his eyes searching hers for answers. She met his gaze steadily, her expression one of resignation. "It's time," she said at last, her voice quiet but resolute. Adelaide, unaware of the revelations above her, decided to leave the chamber. The passage back to the basement seemed darker than before, the oppressive weight of the underground pressing down on her. She clutched her lantern tightly, its light barely penetrating the inky shadows. As she climbed the final steps and emerged into the basement, she was struck by a sudden sense of unease. The air felt charged, as though the storm outside had found its way into the house. She made her way to the main floor, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The three of them converged in the drawing room, each carrying the weight of their discoveries. Eleanor placed the ornate key on the table, its metallic gleam catching the light of the chandelier. Thomas unfolded the architectural diagram, his finger tracing the hidden tunnels that crisscrossed the estate. Adelaide produced the map she had found in the clearing, its newly revealed layer aligning perfectly with the diagram. They worked in silence, their shared goal unspoken yet understood. The map and diagram, when overlaid, revealed a clear path to a single point within the estate, one deep within its foundations, accessible only through the hidden passages. Eleanor took the key, her hand steady despite the turmoil within her. She led the way to the library, where the hidden panel she had uncovered earlier still hung open. The staircase beyond descended into darkness, its spiral seemingly endless. They descended together, their lanterns casting eerie light against the walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to rise from the depths. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a vast, cavernous chamber. The space was dominated by a massive structure, a door carved from ice, its surface etched with intricate patterns. The snowflake emblem was at its center, radiating lines that seemed to pulse faintly with energy. Eleanor approached the door, the ornate key in her hand. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the carvings. Each symbol told a story, fragments of a history she had tried to forget. "This is where it begins," she said, more to herself than to the others. The key fit perfectly into a slot at the center of the snowflake. As she turned it, the door groaned, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The carvings began to glow, their light growing brighter until the entire room was bathed in an otherworldly radiance. The door creaked open, revealing a dark passage beyond. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. The whispers grew louder, their source now unmistakable. Eleanor stepped forward, her resolve unshaken. Thomas and Adelaide followed, their lanterns illuminating the path ahead. The passage led them deeper into the earth, the walls narrowing until they were forced to walk single file. At last, they emerged into another chamber, this one smaller but no less imposing. At its center stood a pedestal, and atop it was an object that seemed to defy description, an artifact of ice and light, its form constantly shifting. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the artifact. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, a wave of energy coursed through the room, the whispers coalescing into a single, chilling voice. "The dead is due. The countdown has begun." And with those words, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Chapter 9. A Starless Christmas Eve. The tremor beneath their feet was subtle at first, a ripple in the ground that could easily have been dismissed as an echo of the storm outside. But as the seconds stretched on, the vibration grew stronger, more insistent, until the very air around them seemed to hum with a foreboding energy. The walls of the chamber began to groan, the once quiet whispers now a chorus of indecipherable voices. Eleanor, Thomas, and Adelaide stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats, as the artifact on the pedestal began to glow brighter. The shifting light flickered in patterns that seemed almost familiar, fragments of images, fleeting glimpses of something larger than they could comprehend. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Adelaide's heart hammered in her chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity propelling her forward. She glanced at Thomas, who seemed equally transfixed by the object, his eyes wide with both awe and apprehension. Eleanor, however, appeared to be waiting for something to happen, something she knew was coming but had not yet dared to face. The room seemed to close in around them as the voices grew louder, their volume now overpowering. The air turned frigid, the temperature plummeting as though winter itself had bled into the earth's very core. The warmth of their lanterns did little to dispel the growing chill that seeped into their bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremor stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the cold remained, pressing in on them like an invisible weight. It was as though the entire world had taken a collective breath and was now waiting for what came next. Eleanor moved first, her hands still resting on the artifact. Her fingers trembled slightly, and her eyes flicked to Adelaide and Thomas, who were both waiting for her signal. "The time has come," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. "The debt must be paid. The keeper is here." The words hung in the air like a warning, and though no one spoke it aloud, they all felt the truth of it settling deep into their hearts. The price of the pact made long ago was no longer a distant threat. It was now a reality, and the cost would be paid in full. Adelaide stepped closer to Eleanor, her mind racing with questions. She had always known there was something darker beneath the surface of her family's history, but she had never imagined it would come to this, to an actual reckoning with whatever power had held sway over the St. James family for so long. "What is the keeper?" Adelaide asked, her voice sharp with the need for answers. "What is it we're facing?" Eleanor turned slowly to face her, her eyes heavy with the burden of the truth she had carried for so long. "The keeper is not a what, but a who," she replied. "A force that has watched over this family for centuries, bound to our bloodline by a pact made in desperation. It is the one who holds the balance, the one who demands a price when the time comes." Thomas, who had been silent up until this point, stepped forward. His eyes, though filled with doubt, were steady as he met Eleanor's gaze. "What happens now? If the debt is due, what are we supposed to do?" Eleanor's lips trembled as she looked down at the artifact, her fingers still lingering on its surface. She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "We cannot escape it. We cannot run from what was promised." She looked back up at them, her expression grim but resolute. "The keeper will come for what it is owed, and we must be prepared to pay the price." Before either of them could speak, the ground beneath them shifted once more, this time with a violent jolt that sent them staggering. The lanterns flickered and nearly went out, but they managed to hold on to them, their flames casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then, in the deepest corner of the chamber, something stirred. A figure, tall and cloaked in dark, shifting shadows, materialized from the very walls themselves. The figure was not fully human. It was an entity, something more ancient, more powerful, with eyes that burned with a cold light. The keeper. It moved with purpose, its form fluid, as if the very concept of space did not bind it. Its presence filled the room with a crushing weight, a presence so overwhelming that it was almost impossible to breathe. The temperature dropped even further, and the faint scent of pine and earth became sharper, as though the figure carried with it the very essence of the winter's night. Adelaide, Thomas, and Eleanor stood motionless, fear paralyzing them. They had been prepared for this moment, or at least they thought they had, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer force of the keeper's presence. The silence between them and the figure stretched out, each moment an eternity, as though the very air itself was waiting for the exchange to begin. Then, the keeper's voice, deep and resonant, ripped through the silence. It was not a voice that was heard with ears, but felt with every fiber of their being. "The time has come," the voice intoned. "The debt is owed. The scales must be balanced. Adelaide felt a shiver run down her spine, her body trembling under the weight of those words. Thomas gripped the lantern tighter, though the heat it offered seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming cold in the room. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice steady but taut with the gravity of the moment. "What do you require of us?" she asked, her gaze never leaving the figure of the keeper. The keeper's eyes glowed brighter, a piercing blue that seemed to burn into their very souls. It reached out, its shadowed form extending toward them like an inexorable force. "The price has been set. The one who belongs to this house must pay the cost." Adelaide and Thomas exchanged a glance, both knowing, though unspoken, what the keeper meant. They had been so consumed with the mysteries of the past, so lost in the labyrinth of secrets, that they had overlooked the most obvious truth. The debt was tied to them, to the St. James bloodline. Adelaide's pulse raced as she glanced at Eleanor, who stood rigid but calm before the keeper. "You're the one who made the pact," Adelaide said, her voice trembling. "You're the one who—" But Eleanor cut her off, her gaze unwavering. "The pact was never meant to be broken. It was a bond forged in blood, and it must be honored." The keeper's form solidified, its presence now all-consuming. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on them. In the stillness, Adelaide and Thomas finally understood. There would be no escaping the past. It had returned to collect its price, and they would have to decide who among them would pay. In the flickering light of the lanterns, the keeper's shadow stretched impossibly long across the chamber, reaching toward them like a final, inevitable reckoning. Chapter 10. The Silent Carol. The room seemed to tighten around them as the keeper's form hovered like a dark, chilling presence. The air grew even colder, each breath that escaped their lips a cloud of mist in the oppressive atmosphere. The lanterns flickered uncertainly, casting erratic shadows across the walls, but they did little to push back the encroaching darkness. Eleanor stood at the front, her eyes fixed on the keeper with an intensity that bordered on reverence and fear. She had known this moment would come. In the quiet corners of her mind, she had always known that the time would arrive when the pact would demand its due. And now it had. The keeper's presence was overwhelming, its essence almost unfathomable. It was not just a being. It was a force, something ancient and immense, woven into the very fabric of the St. James family's history. It was a living embodiment of their lineage's sins, a reflection of the price they had agreed to pay long ago. But now, the cost had come. The one who belongs to this house must pay the cost, the keeper had said, its voice reverberating in their bones, a low hum that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. It was clear now. The price would be a sacrifice, but whose? The question hung heavily in the room, unspoken but felt by all. Adelaide's heart pounded in her chest as her gaze flickered between the keeper and Eleanor. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a sudden surge of dread. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but her voice seemed lost, swallowed by the crushing silence that enveloped them. Thomas, standing beside her, clenched his fists, his jaw set, but there was a growing sense of helplessness in his eyes. It was as though they were all caught in the grip of something far beyond their control, and no matter how much they struggled, they would be powerless to change it. Eleanor, however, did not waver. Her eyes remained steady on the keeper, as if she were facing an old friend. She had known this moment was coming, just as she had known the full weight of the pact she had made so many years ago. A pact made in desperation, in the dark days when the St. James family had teetered on the brink of ruin. A promise that had been sealed in blood and bound by something ancient and unbreakable. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of her family's history, and now it had resurfaced, demanding its payment. The debt, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the keeper's presence, must be paid in full. It is the only way. Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face as the words sank in. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Who has to pay? What does it mean? The keeper's form flickered, its shadowy outline swirling and shifting in the dim light. The ancient being seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its essence radiating an unsettling power. The one who carries the burden of the pact must bear its weight, it intoned, its voice a dark melody that sent chills down their spines. The bloodline must give what is owed. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, delicate object. It was an old locket, its surface worn and tarnished with age. She held it up, her fingers caressing the cool metal as she gazed down at it, her expression unreadable. This locket, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but filled with a weight of sorrow, was a gift given to me by the one who forged the pact. It was to serve as a reminder that nothing comes without a cost. And now, the time has come to honor it. Thomas's face grew pale, his mouth opening to protest, but he didn't speak. The truth was clear now. There was no escaping the consequences. The debt was tied to them all. Each one of them had been marked the moment they were born, and now they were forced to face it. The keeper's form began to solidify, its figure becoming clearer with each passing second. It loomed before them, vast and ancient, a presence that seemed to transcend time itself. Its eyes glowed, cold and unblinking, as it surveyed the three of them, its gaze heavy and unyielding. You must decide, it said, its voice like the crack of ice breaking. The one who carries the weight of this family's sins must step forward. Who will bear the burden? Adelaide's breath caught in her throat, and she stepped back instinctively, her mind racing. She had always known that something dark lingered beneath the surface of her family's history, but now the truth was undeniable. This was no mere family secret. This was a debt that could not be ignored, no matter how much they wished otherwise. And now they had to choose who would be the one to face the consequences. Thomas glanced at Eleanor, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to do this. You shouldn't have to. But Eleanor shook her head, her gaze unwavering. It was my choice, she said softly, and now it must be yours. This is what I promised. The cost is mine to bear, and I will not allow it to fall on anyone else. Adelaide's heart broke at her words, the weight of what was unfolding sinking deeper into her chest. She had never imagined that Eleanor, the woman who had raised her, would have to make such a decision. But now she saw the truth in her eyes. The years of guilt, of unspoken responsibility, had led them to this moment. Eleanor had carried the burden for so long, and now it seemed that it was time for the past to finally catch up with her. The keeper's voice echoed through the chamber once more, its tone of final, irrevocable command. The debt will be paid. Choose, or I will choose for you. Eleanor took a step forward, her expression resolute. She placed the locket on the pedestal, her fingers brushing against its worn surface one final time. She bowed her head, her eyes closing as she surrendered herself to the inevitable. I choose, she whispered. In that instant, the room seemed to hold its breath. The very air around them grew still, as though the world itself were waiting for the next moment to unfold. The keeper's shadow extended toward Eleanor, its icy tendrils wrapping around her like a cloak. The cold pressed in, biting at her skin, but Eleanor did not flinch. She stood tall, her heart heavy but steadfast. The keeper's form reached out and touched the locket, its fingers hovering over the delicate metal. The cost is paid, it intoned, its voice resonating with finality. The debt is settled. The cycle is complete. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, and Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. But then, slowly, The keeper's shadow began to recede, its presence lifting from the room. The chill in the air began to fade, and the oppressive weight of the moment seemed to lift as well. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with the release of the tension that had held her captive for so long. Adelaide rushed to her side, her arms reaching out to steady her. "You did it," Adelaide whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You made it right." But Eleanor only smiled weakly, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and peace. "It was always the only way," she replied softly, and as the keeper's presence vanished, leaving only a lingering trace of cold air in its wake, the three of them were left to face the truth that had been hidden for so long. The debt had been paid, but the cost had been great. And now, as the storm outside began to subside, they knew that their lives would never be the same again. Chapter 11. When the bells toll. The air had shifted, no longer thick with the oppressive cold that had clung to the room just moments before. The keeper, its shadowy form now gone, had left only a hushed silence in its wake. The walls, once trembling with unseen energy, stood still. But the stillness was not peaceful. It was suffocating, a constant reminder that something profound had just occurred, something that could never be undone. Eleanor sat on the stone floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face pale, her body still shaking from the weight of what had just transpired. The locket, once so familiar in her hand, now lay abandoned on the pedestal. Its surface, though small and delicate, seemed to hum with an energy that she could not yet comprehend. It had fulfilled its purpose, completed its function, but Eleanor knew that its meaning was far from over. There was no true release, no finality, not yet. The echoes of the past lingered in the room, in her soul, and she could not yet escape them. Adelaide knelt beside Eleanor, her hands tentative but gentle as they rested on her shoulders. She was unsure of what to say, unsure of how to soothe the turmoil that she knew was still churning within the older woman. The truth was, she too was reeling from what had just unfolded, the stark, undeniable revelation of the family's past, and the terrible price that had been exacted. But she could not help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. Eleanor had given everything to honor the pact, to end the cycle. It was a sacrifice that Adelaide knew she could never fully repay. Thomas, standing in the shadows, watched the two women in silence. His face was unreadable, his expression dark with the weight of his thoughts. The past had come crashing down upon them like a thunderclap, and he too was left to reckon with its consequences. He had seen the truth of it now, the curse that bound the St. James family, the bloodline that had made the pact with the unknown, and the price that had finally been exacted. He could not deny the toll it had taken, not just on Eleanor, but on all of them. But as his gaze flickered to the pedestal, his eyes lingered on the locket that lay there. Its glimmer had faded, but there was something unsettling about its presence, something that spoke of unfinished business. The cycle had been completed, yes, but Thomas felt a shiver crawl down his spine, a sensation that told him this was not the end. No, not yet. There were deeper currents at play here, currents that none of them fully understood. For a long time, the three of them sat in silence, the storm outside having finally quieted into a gentle, distant murmur. The only sound now was the faint rustling of the wind as it whispered through the cracks in the walls. It was as though time itself had paused, holding its breath as the lingering effects of the keeper's presence began to dissipate. And yet, Eleanor did not move. Her gaze remained fixed on the pedestal, her eyes distant and lost in the shadows of the past. It was as though the finality of the moment had not yet reached her, as though she were still trapped in the web of history that had woven itself around her. Adelaide's heart ached for her. She knew the burden Eleanor had carried for so long, the weight of a secret that had never truly been hers to bear, yet one that she had carried for the sake of her family. It was a burden that had shaped her, that had hardened her into the person she was today. But now, it seemed, the price had been paid, the weight of the debt lifted, or so they had hoped. Yet Eleanor's voice, when it came, was so soft, so fragile, that it startled them all. "There is more," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as though she had not spoken in years. The pact was not a simple thing. It was never just about a debt or a price to be paid. It was a binding force, woven into the very fabric of our bloodline. Thomas stepped forward, his brow furrowed with confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with the anxiety that had been building inside him ever since the keeper had left. "You said the debt was settled, that the cycle was complete." Eleanor shook her head slowly, as though the words were difficult to bring to the surface. She closed her eyes for a moment, then looked up at them both, her face weary but resolute. "I thought it was settled too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, the pact was not just a debt. It was a curse, a force that cannot simply be undone. The cost may have been paid, but the threads that tie us to it remain. The keeper may have gone, but there are others who will come to claim what was promised. The balance is not yet restored. The price we paid was only one part of the cost." Adelaide's stomach dropped, her pulse quickening. "What others?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are you saying?" Eleanor's eyes darkened, her expression grave. The keeper was not the end of it. It was only the beginning. The pact is tied to more than just our family. It is tied to this land, to the very roots that we stand upon. As long as we remain here, the cycle will never truly end. There are forces, ancient and powerful, that will come for what they are owed. We have not seen the last of them." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The storm outside, which had seemed so distant and irrelevant just moments ago, now felt dangerously close. The wind howled once more, rattling the windows and sending shivers through the room. It was as though the very elements themselves were warning them. Thomas's voice broke the silence, his tone a mix of disbelief and fear. "What do we do?" he asked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "If the pact is still in place, if the forces tied to it are still out there, what are we supposed to do?" Eleanor's eyes were filled with sadness as she turned to face him. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I do know that we must leave this place. We must leave this house, this land, before it claims us as well." Adelaide's heart skipped a beat. The thought of leaving, of abandoning everything they had known, was terrifying. But she could feel the truth of Eleanor's words deep in her bones. They had already paid one price, but that was only the beginning. The land itself, the very house that had been the St. James family's home for generations, was tied to something far darker than any of them had realized. The storm outside intensified, as though it were responding to the growing tension in the room. The wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters, and for the first time, Adelaide felt a true sense of dread seep into her heart. Something was coming, something that could not be escaped. "We cannot stay here," Eleanor said again, her voice firm, though she too seemed gripped by the weight of the unknown. "We must leave this place before it is too late." And with that, the room fell into silence once more, each of them standing on the precipice of something far greater than they could understand. The echoes of the past were not finished with them, not by a long shot. The cost had been paid, but the real reckoning was yet to come. Chapter 12. The Unopened Present. The decision to leave had been made, but the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, its weight pressing down on them like the very air they breathed. For days, they had prepared in silence, each movement heavy with the knowledge of the danger that still lingered. of the forces that were coming. The house, once a place of comfort, now seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, its very walls betraying the fear that had settled in their hearts. Eleanor, once the matriarch who had held the family together, now moved through the house like a ghost, her steps soft, her gaze distant. She had no words left. The truth she had carried for so long had stripped her of much more than just her secrets. It had taken her spirit. Yet, beneath the sorrow that weighed her down, a quiet resolve had begun to take root. She had seen the signs, felt the shift in the air. There was no escaping what was coming, but she would face it head-on, as she had always done. Adelaide had taken to pacing in the dimly lit halls, her mind racing with possibilities, with what-ifs and maybes. She had never truly understood the full extent of the pact her family had made, the true cost of the curse that had bound them for generations. But now, with Eleanor's words lingering in her thoughts, she could not shake the feeling that they were only beginning to understand its scope, and that understanding only deepened her terror. She had hoped for a simple ending, a final release from the ghosts of the past. But Eleanor's revelation had shattered that illusion. No, the cycle was not yet broken. Thomas, meanwhile, had become increasingly withdrawn. The man who had once been brash and full of questions now appeared to be a shell of his former self. Every time his gaze fell on the locket that still rested on the pedestal, his stomach turned. It was a reminder of the price they had paid, of the lives that had been lost, of the dark forces that had been set in motion by a pact long forgotten. He had never believed in the supernatural, never entertained the thought that the stories whispered in the old legends might be true. But now, he had no choice but to accept that something far beyond their understanding was at play. The night before they were to leave, the house had begun to stir in a way it hadn't before. A low hum had filled the air, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Eleanor had been the first to notice it. She had paused in the hallway, her hand gripping the banister as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling. The sound was distant, almost like a drumbeat, but with a strange, hollow quality. The wind, which had been howling relentlessly outside for days, had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness that gripped the land like a vice. Adelaide had sensed it too. She had walked into the hallway just as Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the window, her face pale. The world outside seemed to have stopped moving. The trees, once swaying with the force of the storm, now stood frozen in place, as though nature itself had held its breath. "It's coming," Eleanor had whispered, her voice barely audible, and for a moment, Adelaide had thought she saw something flicker in her eyes, something beyond fear. Perhaps it was resignation. Perhaps it was anticipation. But Thomas had been elsewhere, tucked away in the study, going through old letters and journals, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might give them a clue about what they were truly dealing with. He had grown obsessed with the past, with uncovering the truth of the pact that had been made, the curse that had ensnared them all. But as he flipped through the yellowed pages of the journal, something had struck him, an entry that had not been there before. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The ink was faded, the handwriting delicate and strange, but the words were unmistakable. "The keeper does not come alone. Beware the price that cannot be seen. The land will take its toll." It was a warning, but from whom? And why had it only just appeared now? Had the journal always contained this message? Thomas didn't know, but he knew that it could not be a coincidence. Something was unfolding, something that had been set in motion long ago. The keeper, the land, the pact, it was all tied together, and they were the ones who had to face the consequences. The following morning, the sun rose reluctantly, as though even it were afraid to witness what was to come. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with a heavy sense of foreboding. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of daily life, now seemed to echo with silence. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Eleanor, Adelaide, and Thomas stood in the foyer, packed bags by their sides. They had gathered only the essentials: clothes, a few precious belongings, and the journal Thomas had found. The locket, still resting on the pedestal, was the last thing to be addressed. It had been silent for so long, but as the three of them stood there, a soft glow began to emanate from within. It was faint at first, but undeniable. The locket pulsed gently, as though it were alive, as though it had been waiting for them. Adelaide took a step forward, her hand trembling as she reached for it. But before she could touch it, Eleanor's voice stopped her. "Leave it," Eleanor said quietly. "It has served its purpose, but its purpose is not ours to decide." They stood there for a moment longer, staring at the locket. Then, without another word, they turned and walked out of the house. The door creaked as it shut behind them, its finality echoing in the cold morning air. The house, the land, the legacy. They were leaving it all behind. But even as they stepped away, a chill lingered in the air, and a feeling of dread settled over them. The road ahead was unclear, a winding path that seemed to stretch out endlessly before them. But the storm was not yet over. They could feel it, each of them in their own way. The gathering darkness, the weight of the past closing in on them, the forces that had shaped their lives, that had shaped the very land they had walked upon, were not finished with them yet. And somewhere, far in the distance, the faint hum of a forgotten drumbeat echoed through the air, growing louder, calling them forward. They had no choice but to follow. Chapter 13. Footsteps in the Snow. The journey away from the house had been longer than any of them had anticipated. The road they took was unfamiliar, winding through barren fields and dense, uninviting woods that seemed to press in on them from every side. It was as though the land itself had been holding them captive, drawing them back with invisible threads, trying to pull them into the embrace of its dark secret. But they pressed on, their minds heavy with the weight of the decision that had led them here, and the knowledge that they could not escape the legacy that had shaped them. Adelaide, her gaze fixed firmly ahead, could not shake the feeling that something was watching them. It was as though the very ground beneath her feet was shifting, as though the earth itself was alive, observing, waiting. Each step she took felt like it was carrying her further into the unknown, further away from the safety of the house that had once been her home. But it was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a prison, and she knew that she could not return, no matter how much she might wish for the comfort of familiarity. Thomas walked beside her, his eyes flicking nervously toward the dense trees that lined the road. The unease that had been growing inside him ever since their departure from the house had reached a boiling point. He had thought that leaving would bring them relief, but instead, it felt as though they had only just begun to confront the true terror of the situation. The Keeper was not gone. The forces tied to the pact, the curse that had bound them all, were still very much in play. They had only just stepped into the storm. Eleanor, who had remained silent for much of the journey, seemed to carry the burden of their shared history with each step. The weight of it was becoming too much for her to bear. Every breath she took felt labored, as though the very air around her was growing thicker, more oppressive. She had thought that by leaving the house, they would be free from the past, from the legacy that had bound her family for so long. But now, she was not so sure. The past had a way of following them, and she could feel it creeping up behind her, ready to engulf them all. As they approached the edge of the woods, the sky above them darkened, casting an eerie shadow over the landscape. The clouds, once light and wispy, now appeared as heavy as stone, threatening to spill their contents at any moment. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, its sharp, biting force a reminder of the storm that still raged within them. The air smelled of rain, of earth and decay, and Eleanor could not help but feel as though they were walking straight into the heart of it. And then, in the distance, they saw it. At first, it was barely visible, a shadow against the horizon, indistinct and shifting like a mirage. But as they drew closer, it began to take shape. It was a doorway, not one of wood or stone, but something far older, far more sinister. It stood at the edge of the forest, framed by two twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to grow from the earth itself, their roots entwined in a way that suggested something unnatural. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was warping in the presence of whatever lay beyond. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized it. It was the same threshold that had haunted her dreams, the same doorway she had seen in the visions the keeper had shown her. She had hoped, no, prayed, that it was nothing more than a figment of her imagination, a trick of her mind in its desperate attempt to shield her from the truth. But now, standing before it, she could not deny it. This was the doorway to the other side, the place where the forces tied to the pact resided, and it was calling to them. Adelaide stopped short, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight before her. Her legs felt weak, as though the ground itself had become unstable beneath her. She had heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined it would come to this. The stories of ancient doors, hidden places where dark forces gathered, were nothing more than legends to her. Yet, here it was, undeniable, real. "What is this?" she whispered, though she knew there would be no answer. There was no need for words. The truth was plain before them. Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "This is where it all began," she said quietly. "The pact was made here, in this place, where the veil between our world and theirs is thinnest. The keeper was only the first part of it, the guardian. The true power lies beyond this door." Thomas swallowed hard, a cold sweat forming on his brow. "You mean, we have to go through that?" His voice cracked with the fear he had been holding inside for so long. He had believed they could outrun the past, that they could escape its grasp by simply walking away from the house. But the door before him was a stark reminder that no matter how far they ran, they could never escape the legacy that had already been set in motion. Eleanor nodded. "We don't have a choice. The pact must be undone. The forces tied to it cannot simply be ignored. If we don't face it now, it will consume us. All of us." Adelaide looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're saying we have to go through that door?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "We don't even know what's on the other side." Eleanor's gaze was steady, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of years of experience. "The only way to end this, truly end it, is to face the source of the curse, to confront the ones who made it, to put an end to the chain that binds us. Only then can we be free." Thomas stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for Eleanor's arm. "We don't even know what we're dealing with. What if it's worse than we can imagine? What if—" Eleanor interrupted him, her voice firm and resolute. "It's not a matter of what we can imagine. It's a matter of what has already been done. We must finish it for all of us." There was no turning back now. The doorway, shimmering with an otherworldly light, seemed to beckon them forward, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The wind howled louder, the trees groaning under its force, but the threshold remained still, silent in its invitation. With one final glance at each other, the three of them stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown. The moment they passed through, the world around them seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and the oppressive weight of centuries-old secrets pressed down upon them. They had crossed into the heart of the curse, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 14. The Midnight Confession. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world seemed to fracture around them. It was not as though they stepped into a new place. It felt more like the fabric of reality itself had bent and twisted to pull them deeper into something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The familiar sights of the woods had faded, replaced by a suffocating, otherworldly darkness that swallowed everything. It was as if they had stepped into a space where time itself had forgotten to exist, where the boundaries between what was real and what was not blurred into a singular, impenetrable void. Eleanor felt the shift in the air immediately. It was cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones, freezing her very core. But it was not just the coldness that unnerved her. It was the stillness, a silence so profound that it threatened to consume all sound. The wind, which had howled relentlessly just moments before, had vanished completely, leaving an eerie quiet that made even the beating of her own heart seem too loud. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing, just the oppressive weight of darkness. She glanced to her side, where Adelaide and Thomas stood. Adelaide's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, though she remained rooted to the spot, as though something were holding her in place. Thomas was visibly shaking, his hands trembling at his sides, though he made no move to speak. All three of them were aware of the same truth, that they had crossed a boundary from which there was no return. They had entered the heart of the curse, the place where the pact had been forged, and it was here, in the suffocating dark, that their fate would be decided. The ground beneath their feet was strange. It did not feel solid, nor did it feel like the earth they had known all their lives. It was as though they were walking on a surface that existed between worlds, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. Each step they took seemed to echo louder than the last, the sound reverberating in the hollow space around them. But still, there was no sign of life. Nothing to explain the way the land seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if waiting for something to happen. Eleanor took a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had felt this energy before, when the keeper had stood before her, when the pact had first been sealed. But this was different. This was not just a lingering shadow. This was something alive, something hungry. Without a word, she began to walk forward, her movements deliberate, though her heart was pounding in her chest. It was as though something was pulling her deeper into the void, drawing her toward an unknown source of power. It was not fear that kept her moving. It was the knowledge that they had no choice but to face whatever lay ahead. The curse, the pact, the keeper. They were all tied together, bound in ways they could not yet comprehend. And the only way to break the chains that had kept them imprisoned for so long was to confront the source. Adelaide followed closely behind, her hand reaching for Thomas's, though she was unsure whether it was for her own comfort or his. His breathing was labored, each exhale sounding like a small surrender, as though the very act of walking forward was a battle he was losing. He had never believed in the supernatural. He had never believed in curses or pacts or ancient powers. But now, as they ventured deeper into the abyss, he felt the weight of something greater than his disbelief pressing down on him. It was a power he could not ignore, no matter how hard he tried. The darkness around them was oppressive, but it was not absolute. As they moved forward, faint glimmers of light began to appear. Soft, flickering sparks that seemed to float in the air, casting an eerie glow on the path ahead. At first, Eleanor thought they were nothing more than tricks of the mind, but as they continued on, the lights grew brighter, more defined. They formed a winding trail, leading them deeper into the abyss. The air felt thick with the promise of something ancient, something old as the very earth itself, and the closer they drew to the lights, the more they felt it, a low hum, a vibration deep in their bones that spoke to something primal within them. And then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath them. It was as though the world itself had decided to turn against them. The path they had been walking on cracked, splitting open like a wound in the earth. A gust of cold wind swept through the air, but it was not the familiar wind of the storm that had raged outside the house. It was sharp, unnatural, biting, and it carried with it the scent of decay. The crack in the earth widened, and from the depths below, a faint light began to glow, a sickly green that illuminated the void with a sickening, pulsating glow. Eleanor stopped, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. This was where it had all begun. The glow grew stronger, and the air grew thicker, as though the very atmosphere were charged with an ancient, malevolent force. The hum from before became louder, more distinct, and Eleanor realized with a shock that it was not just in the air. It was coming from beneath their feet. The earth itself was vibrating with a power that she had only begun to comprehend. She felt it then, a presence. It was not just the land. It was something else, something far more dangerous, something that had been waiting for them, watching them. The Keeper had only been the beginning. The true power lay here, deep within the earth, beneath the layers of time and memory, where the past and future converged in a singular, twisted moment. This was the source of the curse, the place where the pact had been forged, and it was here that they would either break the chains or be consumed by them. Adelaide, standing beside Eleanor, could feel the change in the air. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and a chill swept through her body. It was as though the very essence of her being was being drawn toward the glowing green light, as though it was calling to her, pulling her deeper into its depths. "What is that?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. There was no need for words here. The answer was already known, written in the very bones of the land. "The source," Eleanor said softly, her voice strained with emotion. "The heart of the curse. The place where it all began." Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his body trembling with the intensity of the moment. The fear that had been building within him exploded, consuming him from the inside out. He wanted to turn back, to run away from this place, but something held him there, a force stronger than his own will, urging him forward. He knew, with sickening certainty, that there was no escaping this. They had come too far. They had crossed the threshold, and now they would have to face what lay beyond. The earth rumbled beneath them, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very core of the world. The green light pulsed with an eerie rhythm, its glow growing brighter, more insistent. The hum in the air grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift again. It was as though the earth itself was opening, revealing the source of the curse, the source of the power that had bound them for so long. Eleanor stepped forward, her legs unsteady but determined. She could feel the weight of it now, the knowledge that the moment had arrived. She had known, deep down, that they would have to face it, but now that it was here, she felt a sense of finality. There would be no turning back. They would either destroy the curse, or they would be consumed by it. And as the ground beneath them split open wider, revealing the dark abyss that lay below, they realized that the true nature of the curse was more terrible than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 15. The Final Countdown. The abyss before them seemed endless, a chasm that stretched far beyond the horizon, its depths shrouded in darkness that refused to be illuminated, even by the sickly green glow pulsing from the earth below. The air was thick with an ancient, oppressive force, as though the very atmosphere was saturated with the weight of millennia of suffering. The ground trembled beneath their feet, sending waves of panic through their bodies, but still, they stood on the precipice of something far beyond their understanding. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the yawning chasm. She had known they would come here, that this moment, this reckoning, was inevitable. But standing at the edge, The reality of it gripped her with a force so consuming that it nearly stole her breath away. The curse, the pact, the keeper. They had all led them to this point, this place, this moment in time when they would either face the source of their torment or be consumed by it forever. The decision was no longer in their hands. The time to act had arrived. Adelaide stood beside her, her face pale, her hands shaking as they gripped the fabric of her coat. She had no words left, no strength to resist. She had tried so hard to escape the past, to outrun the chains that bound them. But now, she understood. The curse was not something they could simply leave behind. It was woven into the very fabric of their being, and the only way to break it was to confront it head-on, to challenge the source that had made them prisoners of their own history. Thomas stood a few steps behind them, his body trembling with the weight of what they were about to face. The fear had grown inside him, taking root in the pit of his stomach, but there was also something else, a sense of clarity, a recognition that they had come to this point because they had no other choice. The past could not be outrun. It was a force that could not be ignored, and it would not be silenced until it had been reckoned with. "Are we ready?" Eleanor's voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of doubt and fear. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but its meaning was clear. They were all standing on the edge of a precipice, one step away from either salvation or destruction. Adelaide closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, though she did not move to wipe it away. She could feel it, the presence that lingered in the air, the energy that vibrated through her very soul. It was as though the earth itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make their move. And in that moment, she knew what had to be done. The past, the pact, the keeper. They had all led them here, to this moment when they would either sever the chains that bound them, or be dragged into the abyss themselves. "We have no choice," Adelaide murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have to finish this. We have to destroy it." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with the same unspoken resolve. They had come too far to turn back now. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The curse could only be broken if they were willing to face the consequences, to confront the power that had held them captive for so long. Thomas took a deep breath, his chest tightening with fear. "What if we can't? What if it's too strong?" His voice cracked with the weight of the question, and for a moment, the uncertainty hung in the air like a heavy fog. "We have no choice," Eleanor repeated, her voice firmer now. "We've come this far. We've crossed the threshold, and there's no turning back. The only way forward is through this." With those words, she stepped forward, her heart pounding as she approached the edge of the chasm. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were calling her, beckoning her into the unknown. She felt the pull of it, the lure of the abyss, and though her instincts screamed at her to turn away, she continued to move forward, knowing that this was the moment when everything would either end or begin anew. Adelaide followed her, her steps hesitant but resolute. The chill in the air had deepened, and the weight of it settled over her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She could feel the eyes of the past watching them, the eyes of those who had made the pact, who had bound them to this fate. But now, it was their turn to break free, to sever the chains that had held them for so long. Thomas lingered behind them, his body tense with fear, but his mind was set. He had come to terms with the truth that there was no escape. The darkness, the curse, it had been with them all along. Now, they had to face it. There was no other way. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble once more, and then, without warning, the earth split open. The chasm widened, and from the depths below, a terrible sound echoed, deep and guttural, a roar that seemed to shake the very core of the world. The glow of the green light intensified, becoming blinding, filling the air with an overwhelming energy that surged around them like a tidal wave. The ground seemed to breathe, shifting and writhing beneath their feet, as though the earth itself was alive, a force greater than any of them could comprehend. And then, from the depths of the abyss, something began to rise. It was a shape at first, barely visible through the swirling mist and the blinding light, but as it emerged, it became clearer. Something ancient, something powerful, something born of the darkness that had plagued their family for generations. It was the source of the curse, the thing that had made the pact, the force that had bound them all to a fate they could never escape. The figure loomed before them, its presence overwhelming, a shadow that consumed everything around it. It was neither human nor beast, but something in between. Something that existed outside the realms of understanding, something that had been waiting for them, waiting for this moment when they would either break or be broken. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart racing as she faced the creature that had haunted her family's legacy. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the centuries of blood and sorrow, of deals made in the dark. But she was no longer the frightened girl she had once been. She was ready. They were ready. "This ends now," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We will break the curse. We will take control of our fate." The creature before them seemed to recoil, its form shifting and rippling, as though it were uncertain of how to respond to the challenge. The green light pulsed violently, and the earth groaned, as though the very foundation of reality were being torn apart. Adelaide, standing beside Eleanor, felt a surge of energy course through her. It was a strange, terrifying power, but it was hers. They were no longer passive participants in the story of their family. They were the ones who would end it. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air as though she could grasp the power that surrounded them. And then, with a collective breath, the three of them stepped forward, their united presence enough to force the creature back into the depths from which it had come. The ground trembled, the chasm closed, and the green light flickered and vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. For the first time in their lives, they were free. The curse had been broken, the pact severed, and the darkness that had followed them for so long had been banished. As they stood together, watching the dawn break on the horizon, they realized that they had not just defeated the curse, they had rewritten their own story. The past was no longer a chain, and their future was no longer determined by the mistakes of their ancestors. They had claimed their freedom, and with it, they had claimed their own destiny. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they knew now that they were no longer bound by them. They had crossed the threshold, faced the abyss, and emerged stronger than before. And in that moment, as the first light of Christmas morning touched the earth, they understood the true meaning of redemption, that the end of one story could be the beginning of another.